Okay, today I'm talking to Professor Kathy Charmaz from Sonoma University, California, who is well known for her work on grounded theory, and in particular a version of that which she calls constructivist grounded theory. And I'm going to be talking to her today about her ideas about that and some of the more recent work she's been doing. This includes a second edition of her book, Constructing Grounded Theory, which was published a few months after this interview in March 2014. This book elaborates many of the points covered in the interview. So if I start with the idea of getting data, of gathering data in grounded theory work. Now I know you speak very highly of the idea of ethnography as a method of doing this, but of course interviews too have become very popular. And I guess one of the starting points is that, can you just enter into data collection without any kind of forethought, or do you need to do some planning work to get started?
Well, I think you do need to do some forethought about the people that you are interested in talking with or watching or being with. Yes, I do think there has to be some forethought. One of the things about grounded theory is to remain as open as possible. Mm-hmm. So it's important not to narrow your topic a whole lot. Before starting. Maybe I should give you an example. In the demonstration project with 4 psychologists that I was a part of the team, Fred Wirtz, it's really Fred Wirtz's idea of having each one of us analyze the same data and giving our various comparisons between each other and on. Each step along the way, Fred had another idea. But he originally asked us to look at the data from the standpoint of resilience. And resilience, it's a very useful concept. I totally understand why psychologists are very interested in it, but for me it was too narrow to start with. I wanted to be more open. And in that sense, I've always said that you can take very broad concepts just to start inquiry and to lay out a general frame of inquiry. Like I was interested in identity and self and time when I started as a dissertation student, and these themes have carried through and throughout my career. But with grounded theory, if even the broad concepts that you have don't work in the field, you should try to work with what you find, which I say is always your interpretation. There's always that interaction between you and the data or the field setting.
I mean, some of the classic expressions of grounded theory, the Glaser and Strauss work originally and so on, talks about leaving the literature review till later, so you're not influenced by the ideas of others. Is that something you agree with? I mean, should one... I know you said Henwood and Pidgeon talk about this idea of theoretical agnosticism, of leaving aside the current theoretical ideas. Is that something that one should do as a grounded theorist, or can you have some, what might you call a priori ideas coming into your data gathering?
Well, I think to assume that people leave aside everything is naive. What I'm most concerned is that people grapple with their own starting points and standing points, where they're coming from, the views that they have that are shaped by their positions in society, and you don't see a lot of that. I know a lot of people do it privately, which is all right, but some people don't do it at all. And I think a number of grounded theorists have not entertained how their particular worldview, statuses, their prestige, their power, if they have power, or lack of it, has influenced what they see. And I contend it does. Yes, you need to grapple with it.
Because in the if I may say, the version of grounded theory that you put forward, the constructivist grounded theory which you advocate, you talk about the idea that data are co-constructed. It's an interaction between the interviewer and the respondent in doing that. Is that the kind of thing you mean is coming out here, that some grounded theorists are have pretty strong views that influence how they're co-constructing things?
Yes, and a number of people feel that they don't co-construct, that they're just gather the data.
Right, yeah.
I don't agree with that. I see the world as a world that depends on language, and sometimes our language meets our participants. There's a meeting ground, and sometimes we may have to do a lot more work. And there, I think, working ahead is important. Like if you want, there are more and more ethnographic and qualitative studies in science. And I think particularly in an interview study where they don't have time to teach you about their world, they talk about it, but they don't have time to teach you, that it's incumbent upon the researcher to learn something about those worlds before entering them. So that's one of the ways in which I see researchers needing to prepare themselves. When you talked earlier about the review of the literature, I want to point out that particularly in the U.S. and to some extent here, people have to do research proposals for their dissertations or for their money if they're seeking funded funds from granting agencies, and usually a literature review is part and parcel of either of those. And now with institutional review boards, sometimes some of those institutional review boards demand a literature review. But what so many people don't realize is the literature review that you do for a proposal or even for your doctoral dissertation is not the literature review to do for your articles or your chapters. Once you have categories, then you do the literature review on things that speak to those analytic categories. So here I'm speaking in part as an editor. That ending literature review for, say, your article is much narrower and much more focused and cuts across areas.
To take you back to another aspect of the data gathering, one of the things that's often characteristic or seen as characteristic of grounded theory approaches is the idea of theoretical sampling. I know you've talked a lot about this. How important is it, do you think, to start your analysis whilst you're still gathering data in order to perhaps modify that data gathering? Is that a key aspect of grounded theory?
I'd say it's a key aspect, yes.
Why is that? What's it doing?
The simultaneous data analysis and collection helps you to focus early so you don't make mistakes. It sounds like it might be a mistake to do that, that you might get too narrow. But when you find these leads in data, things that you hadn't thought of pop up in the field or in the interviews, then you can take time to see how important they are and what they mean. And it may be far more interesting than, say, the research question that you started with. So what I tell dissertation students is to the extent that they can, follow these emergent leads, because they're going to find something really interesting and it's going to be pertinent in that particular setting. Sometimes they can't. And so if they can't, maybe they have a very strict supervisor or committee or guidelines for what a dissertation is in their department. Okay, do the original proposal, but keep gathering data and write some on this interesting lead that they found. And then they can write another proposal and have it be much better, much tighter, probably much more convincing, persuasive, for getting, say, funds or designing another research agenda.
But having collected data, obviously the next point, or some data at least, the next point is to start analysing it. And one of the characteristics, again, of grounded theory is the use of coding. And I'm just wondering, you talk about different stages, different kind of steps in coding, and you start with initial coding. I mean, different people in grounded theory have different stages, and some have 2, 3, whatever. But you start with initial coding. And you focus on actions and processes
as much as I can, but you can't always. Why is it?
What is initial coding, and what are you doing by focusing on those things?
The initial coding, I do use gerunds to a great extent as I can, trying to look at what's happening in this data. This goes right back to Barney Glazer's early work, being the first question you ask, what is happening? And he once said, I think in 1978, that grounded theory is the sociology of gerunds, that you trace out processes. What I really like about the method is it's one method that explicitly can help you learn what processes are at issue in a particular setting or area, excuse me, and how to handle process in an analytic sense. So I find that very useful.
So the idea of gerunds is the doing words, isn't it? That when people are doing something, or they're achieving something, or they're making something happen, or whatever. So it's the focus on those kinds of actions that are going on. Is that what you mean by that?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah. And alongside that, the processes. And is that, now I wondered whether that's a reference to a kind of a structural view of the social world. Are you looking at social structures, or do you mean something else by that?
Well, with process, I come from the kind of perspective that structures are created, constructed through people's actions. It goes back to a Marxist position, it goes back to a symbolic interactionist position, where assuming the world consists of change rather than structure. And when you have structures, even very heavy, dominant institutions, they remain so because people act in their routine actions to perpetuate them. And then structures get reified and treated as if they're lasting forever, and people will act that way towards them. So my form of constructivist grounded theory gets back to social constructionism. But one of the things that happened with me is the social constructionist of the 70s and 80s looked at the social construction, how actions constructed processes and structures all over the place, but didn't look at their own process as researchers. They stood outside it. And that's when I moved more to the constructivist view. But the constructivists, there are some constructivists that have what I'd consider a radically individualistic view and are much more mentalist, cognitive. And I'm probably much more consistent with Kenneth Gergen in that sense, Vygotsky, and certainly consistent with symbolic interactionism, with going back to George Herbert Mead, John Dewey, C.S. Peirce.
You advocate line-by-line coding at least,
first.
Although you talk also about section by section or topic by topic and so on, or action by action. I mean, line-by-line coding, I've tried using that. It's very hard to do.
At first.
Okay, right.
At first.
What's the advantage of line-by-line coding then?
There's a certain spontaneity to it, and you can become quite fast at it. I'm always amazed at how quickly, with a few coding exercises, undergraduates can code and come up with something. It may not be terribly sophisticated, but they come up with something that they can work with rather quickly. And the beauty of it is you take those codes that stand out, that seem to speak to the data as you interpret it, and then go with those and start writing memos on those codes. And that can help a lot.
It's interesting you say that, because I think selectivity maybe is an important matter here, because I find with line-by-line coding you create very large numbers of codes very quickly if you're not careful. But you're saying actually you've got to start being selective, and you find things to write memos about, and that aids the process of analysis.
But the line-by-line coding is a way of getting the researcher into the data, looking at it from a different standpoint. It's very different than passive reading. It's active, it's kinesthetic. It gets, well, I do it with a pencil. So I'm actively doing things.
After line-by-line coding, you move on to other kinds of coding. You call it focus coding, axial coding. Now, what do you mean by those terms, and how do you make that transition? How do you know when to stop doing line-by-line, when to move on to the others, or does it come naturally?
Yeah, I think researchers make decisions And that's one thing. With grounded theory, you can make the decisions quite consciously, and then you test it against data. And if it doesn't hold up, you go back and do some more coding. This type of line-by-line coding is very useful when students get stuck. And occasionally you'll have a dissertation student who just can't seem to go anywhere with his or her data. It's a very good exercise to get unstuck. It's also a very good exercise to take a fresh look at material. I'm quite committed to it as a heuristic device, not as a procedure that you have to apply, but I see it as a heuristic device for learning about the world that you are researching.
So if you're learning about the data, if it's helping you analyse it, then use it. If not, then move on to do something else or to do something different.
It works very well for certain types of documents. It works very well for intensive interviews. It may not work as well for behavioristic ethnography. There you might want to compare incidents. And if you notice today in the example, I not only had some line-by-line coding, but I also was comparing incidents simultaneously because I was interested in that particular incident, that type of incident. But one of the things about incidents is I want to caution people not just to take the most dramatic incident, but look at those routine actions and compare those incidents. Whatever it might be, if you're doing something in organizations, how different departments handle their work routinely and treat it as an incident, and then compare it with another department.
I was going to say what you mean by incidents, but it's clear you don't just mean the big, exciting, sudden things that are happening, you mean the routine things too. What are the boundaries of incidents? How do you know something is an incident, and when does it stop and start?
I think it's by definition. By definition.
You know it when you see it, kind of thing.
What?
You know it when you see it.
Yeah. And you can treat an action, the outcome of an action that leads to an outcome as an incident.
Okay, so again, perhaps it depends on your analytic interests, your research questions and so on, things of that kind. How you define it, I mean, to go back to the other kinds of coding you talk about, the focus and axial, I mean, what do you mean by those terms?
The focus coding is usually, for me, it's taking some of my line-by-line codes and elevating them to a higher level where I test the data against them. Now, sometimes the focus codes can come out and say that my codes are very mundane, they're routine, they're boring. I ask, this is such a typical Anselm question, what larger story does this bunch of codes tell me? What is it saying? What do I think it's saying? And then I go with that and see against data. And that can be a useful device.
So you're kind of selecting one of the codes that you've created through line-by-line coding and saying actually something more about it, that you're asking these kinds of questions about what does it tell me?
Or the whole bunch of codes. It can be the whole interview that say that you're coding. One example I had is I was working with some practice data when I was teaching, and the practice data was on interviews with students, and I realized my codes were fairly mundane, as were a number of the people. So I said, what story, what sense do you make out of these codes? And by going to that larger story, this Anselm type of question, people came up with something that was nice and useful.
It sounds to me similar to the problem I know several when I'm teaching students, that very often what you end up with, particularly at the initial stage of line-by-line coding, is very descriptive codes.
It
just
can
simply
be
capturing what's there. And it sounds like what you're saying is moving on from that to something that tells you something more about what's going on and why things are happening and so on.
But you could take even something that's very descriptive and start breaking it up. For example, I do use in vivo codes, which are codes that come out of the natural language of the people that you're talking with. And one that I think that people over here in the UK may resonate with, as do people in the US and North America, is living one day at a time. It came out of Alcoholics Anonymous, but it's very often a term that people with chronic illnesses and disabilities use. So starting to break up that, what do they mean by it? What is a good day? Good Days and Bad Days, the title of my book. Breaking it up, seeing the underlying assumptions. What does it mean? What does it mean in practice? So living one day at a time really, to me, meant pushing the future you had expected in the past aside for now, trying to manage just today, concentrating on just today. It's a way of increasing emotional control. And if if a person thinks that he or she is going to die soon, but still is in that phase of trying to struggle and live, it can be crippling to think, I may die in 2 months. So that's one of the ways of handling depression, of trying to get help one's health, to live more positively during the day. And there's just these assumptions and properties of that category. So it's breaking it up. And grounded theory does fragments data, fragments stories. I use stories in service of the larger analytic issues.
So it sounds like to me that what you're saying is that actually once you start those kinds of questions about the codes, about why is this going on, what's happening, what are people doing when they're doing this, how do they feel about it, and so on, you begin to unpack a whole series of dimensions behind what might seem a simple description of things initially. Right. But actually there's more to it than that. Okay, thanks. We talked about this already, but I suspect it's part of the process. Memoing is again a thing that's mentioned in lots of work on grounded theory as a key activity. And you mentioned writing memos. Presumably this is part of that process of beginning to unpick what's behind a code, is writing memos about it. What is a memo about? Because in some of the early work of Glaser and Strauss, it's very much focused on the codes and the coding. Whereas others writing more recently about it use memos about anything to do with the research process at all. Do you have any feelings about that? Do you restrict it to the coding process, or can it be about anything that strikes the analyst as relevant?
It's not restrictive, and I don't divide them up into theoretical, methodological codes, that kind of thing. Yes, a lot of it is from the codes and the developing categories, but it's also the links between categories, the gaps that you have, your musings about the usefulness of this category. And you might, for people in practice professions, they may see practical implications fairly early on that they want to check. So yes, all those things can go into memos. I really encourage people to have a chronological file of all their memos and to keep them, not just to type over them, but to keep them. And then,
date them and then rewrite
then
them.
Copy and expand and develop.
So it's kind of research diary kind of thing that you're producing.
Yeah. And because some people have trouble moving to the analytic level, or it's easier, one of the things I've recommended is the methodological journal. Richard McGrath, a student, I was on his committee in Australia. He's a business student, and he took up my suggestion of keeping a methodological journal. And I have him write a reflection in the second edition of the book about his methodological journal, and then a short memo that came out of it that I think is really quite marvelous. He had the issues that a lot of professionals do of researching in the same world that he had worked in. So he was questioning to what extent was he seeing things because of his own background, and raise these questions and weighed his interviews. And that was a way of writing a memo that I think was very useful.
Yeah. I mean, are there any guidelines for writing memos? Well,
I've given some just as a basic, basic questions you might raise, but I'm not committed to an absolute formula. I'm pretty fluid in my view of grounded theory, rather than being prescriptive. I encourage people to treat them analytically, to try, first of all, to define things by their empirical properties. I think that can really help move analysis forward. So I encourage people to make their memos analytic. I encourage them to bring data right into their memos. There are times when your memos can become sections of articles or chapters almost immediately. And there are other times where you're grappling with ideas, and you may rewrite and develop that memo 5 times before you're ready to put it into a...
It sounds like you're saying memos are part of a process.
Yes.
Of the process of theorizing, of analysing, and eventually writing about the data and the results you've got.
And they are conversations with yourself. So you don't have the external censor or editor looking over your shoulder, because you're writing them to develop your ideas rather than to report them to someone else.
So they can be private. They can
Yes,
something
they should
only
be
you
private.
see. Yeah.
And I encourage students who are asked to show their memos to supervisors to write their memo for themselves first and then revise it. And the same if you're on a research team. A person who's a little shyer about sharing things may not want to give an off-the-chest memo to other people to read and compare with their own. Might want to have it be more polished.
I guess that could be different if you're working in teams of people. That memos are things you might want to share across the team.
Oh yeah.
But they'd certainly be private to the research team at least. But you might want to have some private to yourself and some you share, I guess, across a...
Right.
But it could be a good way of sharing ideas across the team as well. Okay.
And also coding, sharing the coding. What I do advise people is the person who happens to be an outlier, don't discount those codes in that individual, because they may have the most insightful view of what's happening of anyone.
This has been in a team of people you've got different people coding. Yes, I've done that and actually had kind of research meetings where you come together and discuss the outliers, the different codes that don't fit in with the system you're working with, and sometimes there are some really good ideas that come out of that, that others haven't thought of. But that brings me to another point about this process of moving on the coding from the initial coding into other stages. One of the problems, or one of the challenges that comes out of that, is going back and recoding. If you've got new codes, or you've combined some coding together, or you've got some new dimensions, which I think that's a term that Strauss and Corbin talk about, isn't it? Having codes having dimensions. If you've got that, you're creating more codes. Do you have to go back and recode earlier interviews? Is that something you think needs doing? No,
not necessarily.
Why not? How can you get away without recoding?
Well, I think in grounded theory, you don't have to be as concerned about accuracy as in other qualitative approaches. And if something's theoretically plausible, you can go forward with it and check from that point on, rather than going back and recoding.
So the constant comparison, which is another key term in grounded theory, isn't it, is done with other things from that point onwards, or other things within the interview you're dealing with at that time, and there's no need to go back perhaps to...
Well, there may not be to do all the coding, like when I went back with the moral status and suffering. I just went back and looked to see how that code and category held up against my data, earlier data, and it was great. But I didn't recode all that earlier data.
I see, right, okay. I mean, so it sounds like to me this process also involves the identification of certain key codes I know some theorists talk about this idea of one emergent category that dominates your theoretical view.
Mm-hmm.
Do you take that view yourself, or do you have a multiplicity of codes that somehow explains what's happening?
Well, I certainly believe that you can have more than one category. And the relationship between categories can be very important and can move your work theoretically forward.
So there's no need to think that you're committed to one category necessarily.
No, not in my view.
You can be a lot more generous about
not
that.
in my view, no.
Yeah, okay. I mean, just to come back and again to something we mentioned earlier on, the idea of theoretical sampling. One thing I wondered about here is, I don't know what your view on this is, it's often seen as a way of determining what interviews you're going to carry on doing. So you have an interview kind of research design, and you do a few interviews, you do a bit of analysis on those, and it throws up some issues, some categories, if you like, which suggests that you interview different kinds of people. So theoretical sampling is seen then as a way of varying the actual sample you're taking. But is it always like that, or is it that theoretical sampling can also help you change the kinds of analytic questions you ask of the data, even if you've already collected it?
Oh yes, absolutely.
So it's both those things.
Yeah, and you may go back and see with these new analytic questions that you've got the material right there that you hadn't seen in that way. And I think you're really getting to the crux of the matter, both with coding and then the later theoretical sampling, is that asking analytic questions of the data, of the codes, is what moves grounded theory forward. And a lot of people have trouble asking analytic questions of those early codes, and then the work can remain quite descriptive. But I think you can be pretty analytic.
What does that mean? That's something again which I find certainly students grapple with, this idea of, well, both the idea of being analytic, but also particularly the idea of developing theory as you process the analysis. What is meant by those terms, being analytic and developing theory?
Okay. Being analytic means breaking up the data and really taking it apart and seeing what constitutes it. For me, it means the properties. It means things like the conditions under which those properties emerge. It means what you're being able to define what it is that you're talking about, and not assuming the definition of the term, even if it's a major term in a person's particular discipline, like in nursing, caring. What does it mean? What does it mean empirically? We know a lot of rhetoric and theory about caring, but what does it mean in day-to-day work? And when is it rhetorical as opposed to enacted? And how do you make those distinctions? So I'm becoming more analytic about this term that everybody knows, everyone shares, and takes for granted as having certain meanings. So it's getting into those taken for granted meanings that to me is important, can move you theoretically. I think there's a lot of loose talk about developing theory. In my view, some of the people who are most vociferous about their own developing theory don't necessarily develop theory at all, but they've developed a category. They have a category that they particularly like and have talked about. And it's also surprising to me that many people who claim to be grounded theorists don't define their categories, which to me is the first step in dealing with a category. What is it that we're talking about here? And will that change as we gather more data and do the comparative work?
Is a theory an explanation, or is it something different from that?
That's a good question. I've been grappling with that. The term theory alone is a very good example of a term that everyone tosses around, assumes that we all share the same definition when in fact we don't. And I would say most textbooks use the positivist version of theory as being explanation and prediction. But there are other ways of relating to theory as abstract understanding, of linking abstract concepts together, seeing the relationships. And it may not be a relationship of variables. It may be a way of understanding the world in a more comprehensive, more abstract way. There's certainly the notion of the concepts being variables, which Barney Glaser happens to have, comes out of positivism, still echoed in positivism today. Jonathan Turner, in my discipline, sociology, is particularly adept. He's a positivist and particularly articulate about his view. And I really recommend his writings about it to have a very contemporary view of theory from a more positivist perspective.
I certainly find that a lot of my students are quite intimidated by the idea of developing theory because they think of it as some kind of grand theory. You know, it's kind of, I know it's like Goffman's dramaturgical metaphor, or it's, you know, Marx's idea of class struggle and so on. They've got to come up with, but it isn't like that, is it? Theory can be at different levels and different kinds of approach. Grounded
theorists usually develop theories at the middle range or lower level, I would say, and I think very few grounded theories are basically theoretical. I think not many, but some people write in a theoretical way, but they don't necessarily have theory. They're developing a theoretical perspective, but not making the links between the concepts to give that greater understanding.
Okay, just turning on to another key term that comes up in grounded theory, which is saturation. And I've heard you talk about this as well. I mean, again, it's an issue which is often struggled with by people who are doing grounded theory. I think in part because they're not quite sure when they've got there, when they've reached saturation. And you know, I guess, I mean, I know other people have struggled with it. Ian Day, I think, has written about some of the issues with knowing when you've reached saturation, when you haven't, and so on. Is it just another way of saying you've exhausted everything there can be, or is it more than that?
Well, first of all, I'd like to be explicit about my distinction between saturation of data and saturation of theoretical concepts. There's some anthropologists in the U.S. who are advocating saturation of data and have used the term saturation, but are using it in a different way that grounded theorists do. I'm sorry that they are doing that because I think it adds to the confusion rather than clarifying. I totally agree with them that if you ask people pretty much the same questions, after a while you're going to hear the same stories. But if you're doing grounded theory and asking analytic questions of those data, you're going to have different accounts as you go, that your interviews themselves evolve, not just your own theoretical thinking, but the data that you're collecting is going to evolve. And saturation is very different when you're saturating a concept, when you're trying to find out what the properties of that concept are, what the range of variation of the concept or category is. That's very different than getting the same stories over again. And I think that distinction hasn't been carefully made. So
in grounded theory, we're talking very much about the saturation of concepts.
Absolutely.
The ideas you're developing about your your data are saturated. And what does that mean then when they are saturated?
It's by definition and by claim. And that's one of the weaknesses, that people claim saturation, often by looking at very few cases. And some people argue on both sides of the questions of validating the notion of having many cases, then claiming that saturation can occur after very few cases. Maybe, maybe not. I don't think you can say it with surety. Not to me.
It sounds like it's related to this idea of constant comparison again. if you continue doing your constant comparisons, then eventually you find that you don't find any new differences, any new occurrences, any new variations on the concepts, and that's when you feel you've reached saturation. So.
Well, if your constant comparisons show that there's no new properties emerging, then it's okay to stop. But grounded theory is something that's in process. So at a different point in time, the properties may change because the society may have changed, public opinion may have changed, people's belief systems may have changed. So then I would say certain concepts might change as well.
So it sounds like you're saying for the researcher, they've got to feel that they've exhausted the various kinds of dimensions and different kinds of cases they could look at. But of course, that's only at that time, and they've got to have the confidence to say, okay, that's enough for now. But I might come to this back to this in a few years' time, and things will be different by then. And okay. I mean, the name of the original work by Glaser and Strauss is The Discovery of Grounded Theory, and for many of us reading that, the word discovery suggests there's some kind of objective world out there which we're going to discover. Now, you don't agree with that view, do you? You take a much more constructivist view. I mean, how do you see yourself as different from that kind of view, that kind of objectivist view?
Well, I've always been different from that kind of view. But like a lot of 1970s students, I really didn't have the language, and I didn't have the views to make my philosophical and epistemological views to apply them concretely in the data. And so even before I went to University of California, San Francisco, I had carved out a philosophical point of view about objectivity, truth, and how much of science is based on consensus, and the notion that a theory stands when a group of scientists will agree that accounts for the realities that they're observing, the empirical world. So as a master's student, I was reading physical theorists and Thomas Kuhn and people like that in an epistemology course. So I had that background, which has shaped my consciousness and my awareness that there's an interpretive process here. And of course, having a symbolic and interactionist background too, it complements that with philosophical pragmatism about the usefulness of theory is in practice and what's useful, and how people define that. So I've long had that view, and it does contrast with the notion of discovering an external reality, which is implicit or explicit in some of the earlier works. But there's a real difference between Anselm and Barney, I feel. I've always felt. In conversations with me, I know that Anselm saw much of the discovery book as having rhetorical power. The book was an answer in many ways to quantitative sociology. And in my view, I recall Anselm never expecting the book to have the enormous influence it has had over the decades and the varied audiences that it's had. And certainly it moved into nursing quite quickly because Anselm was teaching nurses all along. The department was in the School of Nursing. There was a absolutely marvelous dean, Helen Naum, who was very innovative and saw the value of bringing in these creative social scientists, and with Anselm heading the team. And that's what developed the program. Part of his agreement was to develop a sociology graduate program, as well as being part of the School of Nursing. So, and the book developed from, the Discovery book developed from their studies of death and dying, their combined studies. But, there's a difference between coming out of the Chicago School of Sociology and coming out of the Columbia University quantitative methods.
It sounds like you're saying that it was almost that Anselm Strauss might almost regret having used the word discovery in the title, that it was part of the rhetoric of responding to the dominant quantitative approach at the time, but actually it has kind of highlighted perhaps some of the wrong issues in qualitative work.
Yeah, Anselm, I've said this before, Anselm is absolutely brilliant, and in my view, the two grounded theory books never represented the fluidity, the brilliance, the freedom of Anselm's thought, because he was, in many ways, a very creative thinker, always way ahead of whoever was around him. So I always thought those books were much more procedural and prescriptive than Anselm was himself. And I see, I don't know if you've looked at it, but there's a couple of very early books that are absolutely wonderful. Mirrors and Masks, The Search for Identity, it's an essay, and Images of the American City. Beautiful book, I think. Then the last book, Anselm's last book, was, to me, represented his theory of action and his grappling with action on a philosophical as well as empirical basis. And it's quite interesting.
So it sounds like what you're saying is that I've certainly come across this in colleagues and students too, who characterise grounded theory as a very kind of objectivist kind of approach. And saying even from the very start it wasn't like that, that actually it was a much more open to a variety of different epistemologies, if you like, of qualitative work. And that your view of the constructivist approach is in some way reflecting that broad spectrum of approaches.
And in the early years, both Anselm and Barney had this notion that rather than going out and reproducing what they had outlined, that the students would adopt and adapt it in our own ways. And at that time, that was fine. It may not be fine now. But both of them were very open about people taking the method. Anselm has talked about that, and Adel Clarke has some quite lovely statements about how Anselm realized that people would take a perspective, a concept, and do with it what they want, not what he might have wanted. He didn't always like what people do with grounded theory. He had that argument with me, which wasn't a serious argument at all. I mean, as far as our personal relationship went, not at all. But I never accepted grounded theory as a verificational method, which he did, ultimately. I see it as something that checks data, but I resist using the language of quantitative research to fit qualitative research in it. And I see verification as being a technical procedure that has certain kinds of meanings and imparts certain kinds of meanings. And in my view, we don't do that. We do check, for sure. And that's one of the strengths of grounded theory, but I don't think we do verification.
That's interesting because it brings me to the point about the other one of the philosophical terms that comes up here: induction, deduction, and abduction. Grounded theory is often characterised as a predominantly inductive process, and this notion of going out and collecting data and from it in some way inducing your theory, your analytic perspective on things. But I've heard you speak on this where you'd say actually that probably an abductive approach is much more captures the quality of what grounded theory does. Now, what do you mean by abduction, and how is it different from induction and deduction?
Well, abduction is another level. Through looking at inductive cases, the classic definition of abduction is that there's some puzzling finding that doesn't fit with the other findings. And with abduction, you try to think of all possible theoretical explanations. That definition comes straight out of C.S. Peirce, who developed the term. And there's that creative imaginative leap. In a forthcoming chapter, Udo Kell talks about can you be creative with abduction? Yes, I think you can, because you put things together in new ways, and you may develop an entirely new theoretical understanding of the phenomenon that you're exploring. But with abduction, there is that creative leap from the empirical finding to accounting for it, to making it understandable. And that's where that looking for all possible theoretical explanations or making one comes in.
I mean, it seems to me quite an exciting idea because it kind of overcomes some of the problems with induction, which is, how do you know it's the black swan problem? How do you know you're not going to find something that contradicts the theory you come up with? And of course, it gets around the deductive problem that you need to have a theory to start with. But it has its own problems, doesn't it, abduction? That I mean, you've got to come up with some kind of theory from a range of explanations that explain this puzzling phenomenon that you've got. But maybe there are several different competing explanations. How do we choose which one?
Well, Peirce would say you develop these hypotheses. He was a scientist and a mathematician, very scientific. You develop hypotheses, and you move with the strongest hypothesis, and you rule out the ones that don't hold up. But you test them against data. And he would gather new data.
Right, because I've also seen some discussion of this in terms of the most the kind of the simplest explanation is the one you should go for, or the most elegant explanation, or things like this.
For abduction?
For abduction.
Yeah, I haven't come across that
yet. You think it's always going back to the data and checking which of these alternative explanations best explains what's going on.
That's my understanding of the original notion.
Right. Interesting. And when we talk about that in grounded theory, then we're talking about finding these puzzling phenomena, these categories that you need to explain or need to come up, and then finding a theory that explains that, or several theories perhaps that explain it, and then going back or creating several theories, and then looking at the data and saying which of these best explains what's going on here. And best would be in terms of what the most variation or the most instances, things of that kind.
That has the greatest range of interpretation and understanding.
Right, so it covers the most kind of different cases and different variations that are going on. That's interesting. Just to go back to the earlier point about discovery and objectivism, I suppose, I mean, what happened after the initial publication of Discovery of Grounded Theory was the turn to language, the move into a kind of postmodern kind of interest in a kind of social construction of the world and so on. One thing that certainly puzzles my students is just whether grounded theory is or is not compatible with a much more kind of constructivist view of the world, in which you're looking at how people are using language and so on. And what's your view on that?
Oh, definitely. I definitely agree that it is. In fact, that's one of my recipes. Pay attention to language. Pay attention to your language, our language, the language of our participants, the implicit meanings in language, how language structures actions and forms a frame for action. Yes, definitely.
That's interesting, because that's very different from the objectivist view that says grounded theory is simply coming up with, some kind of objective explanation or theory about things. Actually, what you're saying here is that it can do both that and pay attention to how people are using the words to construct their view of the world and so on.
And I think that's very consistent with Anselm Strauss. I really do. He was a pretty sophisticated symbolic interactionist. and he realized how naming things said something about your relation to them, or renaming. He has a wonderful quote from John Dewey in his Mirrors and Masks about renaming a phenomenon changes your relationship to it. Yeah, he's been very influenced by Dewey.
Interesting, yes. It often struck me that actually there's a lot of symbolic interactionism in grounded theory and yes, back to the philosophers like Dewey and Peirce and so on, that's important. I mean, that kind of brings me, I guess, to the last point I'd like to talk to you about, which is the history of grounded theory and where it's come from. We've talked a bit about where it's come from in terms of the work of Anselm Strauss and Barney Glaser, and then into others. I mean, yourself with your writing about it, and Juliette Corbin has been working with Strauss before he died, and then she's written about it since then as well. In fact, I think I read you saying that you believe Juliette Corbin is kind of coming more towards your view of grounded theory's constructivist kind of approach to analysing data.
Both the third edition of Basics of Qualitative Research and in a lovely chapter she has in Developing Grounded Theory, the Second Generation, which Jan Morse headed. It was a multi-authored book from Left Coast Press. And she talks about how she's grown and how she began to see her ideas about the research process as outdated, and that she's changed with time. And I just totally admire her for being very open and explicit. And she says that she admires what I do and Adel Clarke does, but she's a little different. I think she's come much closer to the constructivist view, which other people have noticed too. Whether or not she identifies having come closer, she has changed.
It sounds like what you're saying is that grounded theory is not a historic field, but rather a very dynamic and changing field of research approaches.
Yeah, I've argued
it's still developing.
That grounded theory is a method in process as well as a method that can analyze process.
And it's being used in new areas too. I noticed there's a book out recently by Kathy Urquhart, who comes from the information science background, so clearly being used in new areas of research.
Oh, yes.
Does that mean it's changing as well by going into new areas?
Quite possibly. Quite possibly, because people will develop it in the ways that work in their areas. But I've actually had an architect, civil engineer, people from English departments in some of my workshops or classes. So forestry was another one a couple of years ago. Had someone from forestry in Canada.
So it's being used across an enormous range of disciplines then, yeah.
Yes.
Now for the big question, what's the future of grounded theory? Where's it going, do you think?
I think it will develop. It seems to be the most popular form of qualitative inquiry. And I think it's useful, so people will continue to use it. I think it will develop. I hope there are future grounded theorists, perhaps like Robert Thornburg, developing it.
Okay. Thanks very much for talking to us.
Thank you.